Welcome back to Antisocial Cities. Okay, real talk. If you're listening to me right now, then either your teacher is making you or you just really like my content. Let's be honest, anyone who stuck around through 2 episodes on the War of 1812 is a true fan. So I would love for you to consider joining my Patreon. It's my main source of support for all this content that I make, and it means a lot. Check out patreon.com/antisocialcities. Okay, thank you. So far, we've learned and relearned that the US is a conundrum, a mixture of many people, ideas, and many countries in one. Well, now we're starting to enter the find out portion of the story. First, a few continuities in US history. We hate taxes. We can't decide how powerful the federal government should be. We want to expand, roam, colonize, conquer, invade, whatever you want to call it. Americans always want more. And nothing epitomizes this more than the frontier. Americans in the East saw it as the edge of civilization, wild land that was untamed and unclaimed. Meanwhile, indigenous Americans and Mexicans are like, hello, should we be worried? Yes, always. Think about it this way. From the beginning of our history, Americans have been frontiers people. First, they traveled across the ocean to unknown territory in the New World. One of the reasons we got so angry with the British to begin with was because of the proclamation of 1763 that said we couldn't go west of the Appalachian Mountains. When we were still just a few years old, we bought the Louisiana Purchase, even though we had absolutely no need for it. Jefferson was just like, treat yourself. The War of 1812 was mostly motivated by the desire to expand unbothered into that new territory, but we were also secretly hoping to get Spanish Florida and British Canada out of it. Americans be expanding, but every time we expand, the question of slavery comes up. Would slavery be allowed in this new land? And every time Congress got into an argument that verged on a real conflict, they would come to some compromise that just pushed the issue down the road. In the first half of the 19th century, the Missouri Compromise banned slavery in the northern half of the Louisiana Territory, while admitting Missouri and Maine as a new slave and free state, respectively. Other similar compromises constantly kept the balance of power equal. Neither side wanted the other to get more senators. So westward expansion complicated things for our young country, but it also led to demographic changes in US voters. As more frontier states were admitted into the Union, many elected leaders pushed for universal white male suffrage. By the 1820s, most states had removed the property requirement for voting, and this ushered in a new era of leadership away from just the wealthy white male elites toward a more populist group of leaders, still white men, coming from the common people and the military. And in walks, to capitalize on all of this demographic change, Andrew Jackson. Born into poverty in South Carolina before settling in Tennessee, Jackson was the first president of the so-called common man. He rose to prominence in the War of 1812, fighting the Native Americans along the frontier, and he emerged as the hero of New Orleans after defeating the British on the Mississippi River. Jackson is a fascinating and problematic president to study because he basically just does whatever he wants. Like during the War of 1812, without anyone really asking him to, he followed British troops around the South, eventually taking his troops into Spanish Florida. He marched all the way into the foreign territory, took control of Pensacola for a while. I'm sure everyone in Washington was like, can he do that? I don't know, but he just did. That basically sums up Jackson in a nutshell. He defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans, and although it was fought after the war had officially ended, Jackson became a national celebrity. After the close of the war, Jackson was named commander of the Southern District. Now he delegated and entrusted the command of the troops in the field to subordinates while he retired to his home at the Hermitage near Nashville, but he was ordered back to active service at the end of December 1817 when unrest along the border appeared to be reaching critical proportions. There were Indian raids along the southern border with Spanish Florida, and Jackson was like, "You again? I thought I invaded you already." Now, Jackson's instructions were vaguely to subdue the unrest along the Florida border, but he heard, "Conquer Florida, please." He captured 2 Spanish posts and appointed one of his subordinates as the new military governor of Florida. A crisis emerged between Washington, D.C. and Spain, who would eventually sell the territory to the U.S. And Jackson's reputation was only saved by a strong defense from the current Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. Irony. You see, a few years later, Jackson ran for president, and his biggest opponent was none other than John Quincy Adams, the son of the founding father and a pretty popular figure amongst the Washington elite. Adams was the perfect character foil for Andrew Jackson. Together, they represented the old and new sections of the U.S. Adams was East Coast privilege, while Jackson was a frontier lawyer from Tennessee. Thanks in part to newly introduced universal white male suffrage, you no longer had to own property to vote in most states. Jackson won both the popular vote and he won the most electoral delegates in 1824, but neither number was a clear majority because there were 4 total candidates in that presidential election. In this case, that meant that the decision went to the House, where John Quincy Adams was known and quite popular. Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who had been running but then decided not to, threw his support behind Adams. And then mysteriously, when Adams was chosen by the House as president, he quickly made Henry Clay his Secretary of State. Jackson's supporters across the country called this a corrupt bargain and used it as evidence that the government was an elite insiders club that ignored the desires of the common people. 4 years later, in 1828, Jackson won in a landslide, becoming president. Side note, the election of 1828 basically killed his wife. 1828 was really the first year that presidential candidates actively campaigned. They toured around the country giving speeches and kind of spread propaganda for their candidate and against the other. Rachel Jackson was vilified in campaign pamphlets as an adulterer because there'd been a mistake with her divorce paperwork that meant that she was not technically divorced when she married Andrew Jackson. Many believe that the stress of the campaign took its toll, and she died just a month after the election. And she had made it clear that she dreaded the idea of being the first lady, saying, quote, she would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than live in that palace. Well, be careful what you wish for. Besides clearly being an important moment in Jackson's life and career, the election of 1828 is also a turning point in the political history of the United States. Jackson was the first president from the area west of the Appalachian Mountains, evidence of the rise of a third section to compete with the North and the South. For many, Jackson was the people's president. Although he eventually became one of the largest landowners and slave owners in Tennessee, he was the first president born into poverty. But this doesn't mean that his policies or ideologies were necessarily in sync with what the lower classes wanted. In fact, for 30 years, he had been part of the conservative faction in Tennessee politics, and during the financial crisis of 1819, he vigorously opposed legislation that would give relief to those in debt. But the common people saw him as their guy, someone who, at least better than the perfectly coiffed pretty boys in Washington, could speak to their experience. And in many ways, he lived up to that reputation. On the night of his inauguration, he opened the White House up to the public and threw a huge party on the White House lawn. The neighbors all locked their doors and stayed in their homes, terrified of the mobs of drunk people partying it up on the White House lawn. Nicknamed the inaugural brawl, this was a portent of the way Jackson would run his White House. However, he damn well chose, thank you very much. His opponents in government referred to him as King Andrew. He ran his administration like a military commander, and he was less interested in experienced politicians and instead relied on friends and supportive newspaper editors to advise him. He's known for a practice known as the spoils system. The idea was that as to the victor go the spoils, those who supported the new president should get something out of the deal. I don't know, maybe a job in the bureaucracy or something. Immediately after he became president, almost 1,000 civil servants, career bureaucrats, were removed, fired, to make room for people who had supported Jackson's campaign. Now, it's one thing to fill your presidential cabinet with people in your party who agree with you, but it's another to purge those in the government who had been dedicated bureaucrats through multiple administrations and fill those positions with unqualified buddies from back home. Now, Jackson is fascinating, and I would recommend you go read more about him, but for our purposes, there are a few key events during his presidency that can help us understand what's going on in the US during the 19th century. First is the Nullification Crisis. So you should all know by now that I really don't like talking about economics, but unfortunately it's quite important because a major issue in 19th century politics is tariffs. Now, tariffs are essentially taxes on foreign goods coming into the country. And in general, during this time period, people who are in business and manufacturing, they want high tariffs, and farmers want low tariffs. And let's use a really dumb example to explain this, like chairs. Literally every year when I talk about this with kids, I try to think of an example off the top of my head of a thing that Americans might have made in the 19th century, and every year I draw a blank, and I literally can't think of a thing. So I always just go back to chairs, which is technically a thing that I'm sure some Americans made, but it's also the lamest example ever. Oh well, I'm committed to the bit. So let's say that some other country is a big producer of chairs, and they want to sell their chairs in the US. People who are chair makers in the US would want a high tariff on chairs to protect their industry, to raise the price of foreign chairs, so that hopefully more people will buy yours because they'll be cheaper. And you might even be able to raise your own prices as long as you keep it lower than the foreign competition. Got it? Great to be a chair maker. But if you're, let's say, a farmer, you don't make chairs, you grow cotton. So you, the farmer, have to buy chairs. You don't want a high tariff because that raises the price on all chairs and means you have to spend more of your hard-earned money. So way oversimplified, during the 19th century, typically people in the Northeast supported high tariffs and people in the South and the West didn't. Okay, yada, 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 a high tariff was passed and South Carolina especially was pissed. They argued that they had the right as a state to not abide by a federal rule that they deemed bad for their constituents, in this case, the tariff. Again, it's this question, who has more power, the federal government or the states? Now, Jackson argued that the federal government did, because in this case, he was the head of the federal government, so of course he did. He marched troops down to South Carolina to enforce the tariff and make them accept it as law. South Carolina backed down for now. South Carolina is really upset that the federal government is encroaching on its states' rights to make its own economic decisions, and so they threaten to secede? Wait, where have I heard that before? Oh, right, 30 years in the future when it literally happens again over slavery. Okay, back to Jackson's presidency. The other event he is infamous for is his mistreatment of Native Americans. He became a national war hero to white Americans fighting the indigenous people in the West and in Florida during the War of 1812 and later. But as president, he's going to go even further in asserting white American dominance over indigenous land. In 1829, people in Georgia were like, we want more land. And then they noticed 9 million acres of land inside the state of Georgia where no one lived. And by no one, I of course mean Native Americans were living there, but they apparently were invisible to the people of Georgia. The state ended up allowing white Georgians to settle the land, in this case, invade foreign territory, despite the fact that the Cherokee Indians had a land title that was guaranteed by a treaty with the United States. The Native Americans were like, can they do that? And the Supreme Court answered with a resounding no. States cannot violate federal treaties with foreign nations, in this case, the Cherokee Nation. In a shockingly ethical move, the Supreme Court ruled on the side of the Native Americans. And in walks Andrew Jackson. He responded to the Supreme Court's decision by saying, and I quote, Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. What? That's literally your job. AJ, you're the leader of the executive branch. You know, the one that's supposed to execute or enforce the laws passed by Congress and the decisions handed down by the Supreme Court. Like, you're that guy. But nope. Jackson didn't send troops down to protect indigenous land, and he did nothing to stop white settlers from flooding into the native territory, which, again, I just want to make sure we're really clear, was a foreign country protected by a treaty with our own federal government. In 1830, Congress passed the new Indian Removal Act, giving the president the power to give unsettled land in the West to Native Americans in exchange for their homeland, basically nullifying all the previous treaties that had been negotiated with each tribe. Without really any other options, the Cherokee were forced to sign a new treaty that gave up all of their 9 million square feet of land in Georgia for new territory west of Arkansas. 3 years later, rounded up by General Winfield Scott, 15,000 Cherokee were forced to walk westward on what is now known as the Trail of Tears. Along the way, 1 in every 4 died of starvation, illness, and exposure because, they were forced to leave their homes in the middle of winter. This wasn't a one-time event. Throughout the 1830s, Native Americans across the Southeast were forced from their tribal lands and funneled to the west, mostly to modern-day Oklahoma. The majority were from the so-called 5 civilized tribes, which included the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole Indians. The Seminole resisted the most, forcing a second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842. The first Seminole War was sparked by Jackson's invasion of Florida in 1817 after being authorized to go in to a foreign territory and look for escaped slaves. So, they're not a huge fan of AJ down there in Florida. So what can we learn from Andrew Jackson? Well, for one, not all presidents have a clear guiding philosophy. He was elected by common men who mostly wanted the federal government to have less power over their lives, unless they could get a job working for the federal government, in which case they were happy to be spoiled by Jackson. And even though most of his supporters didn't like high tariffs, he used the power and might of the federal government to enforce a tariff in South Carolina. But then, when the Native Americans needed a powerful federal government to step in and enforce the Supreme Court decision, he backed away and said, I'm leaving it up to the state to figure it out. Oh, and also, when the charter to renew the Bank of the United States came around, he let the bank and Hamilton's dreams die because he and his supporters saw the bank as a tool for the powerful business elites that wasn't serving the common man. His decision to spread the government money out across pet banks in various states would ultimately lead to an economic panic, but he was out of office by then, so it wasn't his problem. Sorry, Van Buren. So Jackson's guiding philosophy seems, to me at least, to be self-interest. He was more than willing to use the federal government when his authority was threatened by white Southerners. But then he sided with those same people when he realized he could earn their support on another issue, and all he had to do was commit genocide against Native Americans. This confusing philosophy also had the important impact of splitting the confusing and confused Democratic-Republican Party. Basically, those who supported Jackson, mostly states' rights people and those who don't want to be told what to do by the New England elites, became the Democrats. And one of Andrew Jackson's many nicknames became the symbol of their party, the jackass, or more politely, the donkey. And those who opposed Jackson, and there were many, moved away from the Democrats and joined the Whig Party, some of them eventually forming a little faction called the National Republicans. Honestly, I'm just going to oversimplify and start calling them all Republicans right now. Sorry to all of you Whigs out there who I'm admittedly writing out of history, but we should have time to figure y'all out. The political vibe of the Jacksonian era is going to trend towards westward expansion and economic opportunity for the common man, sometimes at the expense of national interests. The increasing polarization of the various political parties starts to get so intense that Congress literally implements a gag rule banning any discussion of slavery in the House of Representatives. And there are going to need to be discussions about slavery because we're about to stumble upon 525,000 square miles of new land that Mexico just ceded to us for some reason. There's got to be more to that story. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.